Hello, I'm Suzanne Fagence Cooper and welcome to my talk for the Watts Gallery. I know that many of you, like me, were looking forward to going to Compton to visit the exhibition that they have there about John Ruskin and his life and work. Unfortunately, we can't do that at the moment, but what I'm hoping is that through my technology, through the online lecture, I can show you some of John Ruskin's extraordinary watercolours, and with him we can travel to some of his favourite places in the Alps and in Italy and also in the Lake District, and find out some more about the way he wrote and the way he inspired people to draw and to look more closely at the world. So John Ruskin celebrated his 200th birthday last year. There have been many different events across the country to commemorate him as an art critic, as a writer, as an artist himself. Now, in many of the images we know of him, he looks rather sad. He looks like he is almost telling us off. But that's not how he was at all. He had an amazing facility for excitement in the natural world, for enthusiasm, for passionate looking. He talks wonderfully about, well, this is one of his phrases. He says, "You were made for enjoyment, and the world is filled with things you will enjoy, unless you are too proud to be pleased by them or too grasping to care." He makes us refocus on the things that are important, I think we find. He goes on, "Remember, the most beautiful things in the world are the most useless. Peacocks and lilies, for instance." So, although we may see him as this sort of prophet or thundering preacher, we must also remember his humanity, the way that he is trying always to reach through the page and to encounter us and to encourage us. I think that's the thing that I've learnt most when I've been reading Ruskin, writing about him, meeting people who have worked in and around his field, so whether that's at his house at Brantwood, whether it's at the collections in Sheffield, or whether it's just people who are putting on special exhibitions. So we see here, for example, the very late photographs that Frederick Collier took of Ruskin when he was in seclusion in Brantwood in the Lake District. And most people know the one where he's looking out of the window, he's looking away from us, he's looking very distant from us. But the one I prefer was taken exactly the same, sitting, and he's looking directly at us, and he wants us to join him in exploring the smallest things as well as the biggest things. This is the great surprise of Ruskin, is that he often leads us to the very small as well as the mountainous. So he enjoys the exploration of the natural world, and he wants to understand it. And in all of his writings, he's not writing to teach us how to become professional painters. He's not writing to teach us how to become professional art critics. His idea is that by looking more closely, we will then understand how the world works, how a dragonfly becomes iridescent, or a kingfisher, or a wing, or a feather, or the movement of a snake. These small things really mattered to him. And particularly at the moment when we see the world springing up around us, we see the blossoms, we see the greenery. I think these extraordinarily delicate works that he mostly gave to the Ashmolean collections, they're now in the Ashmolean collections in Oxford, they were given as teaching aids, as sort of lecture diagrams, these very carefully observed ways of thinking about the complexity of the natural world, things that we might overlook. And this is one of the things that he does very often. There's a wonderful book that he writes in the middle of his life called Proserpina, which is about wayside flowers, the things that we haven't brought into the garden, the things that are often just disregarded by gardeners or trampled on as we walk, but the things that are still very beautiful, although they are not showy, although they're not glamorous. The field narcissus, the little snake's head fritillary that would be seen in the meadows around Oxford. So how did he come to be this person with this extraordinary, well, he sort of sensual faculty of the eye is what he calls it. He loved to look, and he then loved to tell us about it. And in none of his drawings or his paintings, none of them were made to sell. He was never an artist who would put his works of art into the market. What he was trying to do is to use the time and the leisure that he had to explore the world and to open it up for people who maybe didn't have that time and that leisure. And we see him in this little picture that was made when he was a very small boy, outside, running about, still in his dress. So he hadn't gone into his trousers yet. He was still in his frock. So a very small boy. And you can see that his parents were very keen to remember this moment of childhood. Now, his upbringing was very unusual, and much of what most people know about Ruskin is in fact about his personal life. He was the only son of older parents, parents who couldn't get married until in fact, his mother was nearly 40 when she had him. And so he was very cosseted, very doted on. And he travelled widely for a young person. He was very often taken with his parents when they went on their trips, their professional trips. His father was in business, he was in trade. And this was also always a little bit of a concern for the Ruskin family, because it meant that they were not of the highest class. And there was a lot of sort of social concern around the family. In fact, his mother had been brought up, she was born in a pub. And so they never had that ease among the wealthy people that they met. There was always an anxiety there, which I think explains a lot of Ruskin's hang-ups. But his father would go on his trips around the country selling the sherry to his aristocratic clients. And they put Ruskin, the little boy, up on the especially made little seat for him in their carriage where he could see out. He could go through Wales, he could go through the Lake District, he would travel all across Britain. And so by the time he went to university, he already knew the country fairly well. And his father did not want him to go into trade. In fact, his parents expected him to go into the church. And so his father, in fact, said later, he could have been a bishop. And I think they'd have been a lot happier in many ways if he had, because they never really got to grips with how he, transformed his preaching skills and his learned skills into art criticism. Anyway, he went to Oxford. He had a place at Christ Church, and this here is a scene that he would have walked past every day, down the little Magpie Lane back towards his college, which was Christ Church, just to the right of Merton College here. And the reason he did that every day, that little walk every day, is because when he went to university, when he went to Oxford, his mother came too. She didn't want to leave him behind. So every evening he would go off and have tea with her and catch up with her. And he didn't think this was odd. None of them thought it was odd. They were a family unit and they stuck together. Obviously, all the other undergraduates thought it was very peculiar, but they did discover, his friends, his colleagues, contemporaries, did discover that he had this amazing facility for drawing. And so although he was seen as quite an outsider, there were times when they really wanted his help, and making these very accurate drawings of architecture, and particularly Gothic architecture, medieval architecture, was something that he became very good at. And one of the reasons why he loved this period, this medieval period, was because he had been attracted to it by other things he had seen. So he had travelled all around England, but he also had begun to think about travelling around the continent. And the person who had kicked off that real excitement for continental travel, particularly in Italy, was Turner. Now, J.M.W. Turner became the sort of talisman for Ruskin. He became the focus of Ruskin's artistic life for much of his early part of his career. Ruskin thought that Turner's work was often criticised unnecessarily, and Ruskin wanted to step in and support Turner. And the reason that this all sort of came about was that Ruskin was given as a very young boy, actually for his 13th birthday, this little book of poems called Italy. Now, the poems were by Samuel Rogers, but they were illustrated by Turner, and they show the travelling, the whole experience of how you pass across the continent, through the Alps and down into Italy, and you discover the medieval world of Venice and then the classical world of ancient Rome. And this just inspired Ruskin in extraordinary ways. He became completely focused on how you can make this art part of your life. And it's almost as if you imagine giving a 13-year-old child, I don't know, The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. It's an imaginary world which you kind of build yourself into. And that's the experience that Ruskin had through this book of Italian engravings. So there came a point where the family did have enough money that they could travel and they could get through the Alps and they could see these things firsthand. And for Ruskin, that love of the Alpine scenery never left him. He went back again and again. And we can see a work here made in the middle of his life where he just is so excited by the rolling mists coming up over the spine of the hill, of the mountain. And in fact, it almost looks like a dragon that's curling round the top of the mountain. And his excitement about the colour, about the movement. And he returns to the Alps again and again, partly because you have to pass through the Alps in order to get to Italy. And he and his parents visited northern Italy at various points, but it was that experience that was overlaid by his love of Turner. And his father had started to collect some Turner paintings. They began to talk to Turner face to face. He was sometimes invited, for example, to John Ruskin's birthday parties. And it was quite an uneasy relationship. It wasn't a straightforward relationship at all, because Turner didn't always enjoy the way that Ruskin kind of piled in. I don't think Turner enjoyed this kind of descriptions where Ruskin is saying that the older artist, for example, is sent as a prophet of God to reveal to men the mysteries of his universe, standing like a great angel of the apocalypse. And there you hear the biblical tones that come through again and again in Ruskin's writing because of his way he was brought up with the Bible, with the King James authorised version of the Bible, always at the background of the way that he writes. So these things were slightly unnerving for Turner, but also for Ruskin it was a way to understand how an artist works, because Turner was seen by Ruskin when Ruskin started to write his first big essay, which was called Modern Painters. And initially it was meant to be a relatively sort of restricted focus on Turner and other modern painters compared with older artists. But it grew and grew and became a study about clouds and the Alps and all sorts of other things. And Ruskin keeps trying to boil down this idea of what it is about a painting that makes it true, that makes it beautiful. And he has this idea about truth to nature. So we should look directly at something and record it. But that is not necessarily a photographic record, although he does use photography, as we'll see later. It is a record of your experience. So with a painting like this, the San Benedetto by Turner, there's a wonderful description by Ruskin that explains how our relationship with the world is not just about what we see with our eyes, but also what we experience. In fact, he calls it heart sight, deep as eyesight. So heart sight, I think, is the way that he would experience this vision of Venice. So let me just read you a section from what Ruskin says. He says, "There is no church nor quarter belonging to San Benedetto in that area of Venice. The buildings on the right," Ruskin goes on, "the buildings on the right are for the most part imaginary in their details. And yet, without one single accurate detail, the picture is the likest thing to what it is meant for that I have ever seen. The buildings have, in reality, that proportion and character of mass, as one glides up the centre of the tide stream. They float exactly in that strange, mirageful, wistful way in the sea mist, rosy ghosts of houses without foundations. The flowing water, the flowing gold of the water, and the quiet gold of the air face and reflect each other just so. Take it all in all, I think it is the best Venetian picture of Turner's which is left to us. So although this is not a real place in Venice, For Ruskin, it is the best experience of Venice that we could have as the sun sets, just waiting on the water there. So he explains in Modern Painters there is a moral as well as a material truth, a truth of impression as well as form, of thought as well as matter. And these things start to become bigger in his writings, that how do we engage with the world, how do we look at it directly, and also take responsibility for what we are looking at. And it's not just about a painting on a wall, it's also about the entire environment, I suppose, in which we look at the world, we look at Venice. How did it come to be like this? Why do we love it so? Now, one of the people who inspired Ruskin to spend as much time in Venice as possible was his wife. Here she is, Effie Ruskin. She was born Effie Gray, and she was the eldest of a very large family of children born in Scotland, in Perthshire. And because her mother was so often in confinement, Effie became the hostess. She helped her father, who was a bank manager, an entrepreneur. She helped him entertaining. She helped him. They were a very sociable family. They had lots of kin close by and business associates. So their house was full of children and noise and laughter and music and parties, very different from the house that Ruskin grew up in. But in fact, the house where Effie was born, the house where all these parties were happening, was the house where Ruskin's parents had lived when they were younger. Although they'd had some very bad experiences there. Ruskin's grandfather had committed suicide there, so they never went back. And this house had been bought by the Gray family, and they knew each other. The Ruskins and the Grays knew each other from several generations back. So there was a sense of that they were almost cousins. That was one of the things to explain the relationship between Effie and John Ruskin. He was a fair bit older than her. He was nearly 30 when they married, and she was 18. But there is a sense when they became engaged, she already had a lot of experience. She was very well versed in music and modern languages and reading, and she loved entertainment. And she was very beautiful. She was very tall as well. I think she would hold your attention if she walked into a room. So she would occasionally visit the Ruskin family in London, and Ruskin would like to take her into town. They would go to the theatre, they'd go to art galleries, she'd go and meet some poets. And when he proposed to her, which was by letter, all of their courtship really was on paper. And John Ruskin's father says that John is better in writing on paper than face to face. And so you can imagine John pouring his heart into his love letters, trying to craft them, trying to make them as beautiful as possible. And Effie, she had a real taste of this London life. And also her father's businesses were not doing very well. She needed to marry. It was the only job offer open to her. A young woman in her position had no other opportunities in her life. She needed to marry, and to marry well. That was her role in life. And so when John Ruskin makes her an offer, he's an only child of wealthy parents, and they get on very well. There's no reason to see that this won't work. And they have a very difficult marriage, even at the outset. They both have bad colds. His parents won't come to the wedding. It's all a bit of it's all a bit sad, really. It doesn't go off quite as well as they hope. But they keep coming back to this idea, it will get better, and that we read their letters, and they are very heartfelt, that they both wanted this to work. But John Ruskin's parents were very interfering, and I think we can look at this in another lecture, perhaps. The relationship there. It's very complicated, and as you probably know, not very happy at the end of it. But in order to get Ruskin away from his parents, their sort of cloying oversight of his relationship with his wife, Effie suggests that they go back to Venice, spend more time there, really settle in for the winter. He could do lots of drawing. He can get to grips with the complexities of a place like the Ducal Palace, which he's been, itching to understand. Ruskin always sees the interconnectedness of things. So this palace is the sort of the blossoming of a much more complex historical set of events, and the way in which artists come together and different artistic styles come together, and the whole idea of a mercantile business centre like Venice becoming the art centre. And he hopes that by teasing out some of the ways in which Venice becomes so beautiful and so complex, he can then feed that back into, well, hopefully what will happen in England, which is also a great mercantile centre, a place of businessmen rather than and of merchants, rather than of kings and queens necessarily. There are ways in which ordinary people can make beautiful things. And the thing that he keeps coming back to is this close relationship between the natural world and beautiful art, that idea of being true to nature. And you can see here in the columns, the capitals of the columns in the Ducal Palace, how Ruskin has very carefully worked out that each one is different, and each one has a different foliage or floral forms in it. And this goes back to his constant study of natural objects, particularly things, as I said, that aren't often the focus of high art, you might say. And he comes to the conclusion that the distinctive thing about a Gothic building is this love of the natural world. He says, to the Gothic workman, the living foliage became a subject of intense affection. The love of change is at once soothed and satisfied as it watches the wandering of the tendril and the budding of the flower. And so this idea of being able to study the natural world closely and then turn it into a carving or even an entire building. He says it was no chance suggestion of the form of an arch from the bending of a bough, but a gradual and continual discovery until the stony pillar grew slender and the vaulted roof grew light, till they'd wreathed themselves into the semblance of summer woods. So this idea of a Gothic cathedral or a hall with its great pointed roof being like, walking through the summer woods. The pillars are the tree trunks and the bending of the boughs above our heads. And he writes about how the sensual faculty of pleasure in sight is the thing that drives him and that he wants to inspire other people in. And he believes that he shares that with the Gothic workmen. They were, as in his eyes at least, mostly men who were making these extraordinarily diverse works of art. He talks about their magnificent enthusiasm, their unselfishness of sacrifice, and a profound sympathy with the fullness and wealth of the material universe. So he tries to bring all these things together in his next big book. So he's written most of Modern Painters. He comes back to it again and begins on the Stones of Venice, which will be a history and architectural study as well, side by side. And he brings that together. He has to start writing it up when he gets home, and so they have a holiday in Scotland where he is working on the indexing for the Stones of Venice. And this holiday, he comes with Effie, but he also comes along with a young man called John Everett Millais, who Ruskin sees as a great hope for British art, because Millais understands the beauty of the natural world, is able to capture it on canvas. And John Ruskin hopes to be able to teach him, how to be the best painter. This is in the aftermath of Turner's death. Turner has just died, and so Ruskin is looking for the next generation of great artists to follow in Turner's footsteps. And here you see Ruskin standing rather, well, he always looks slightly uncomfortable, I think, standing on the edge of this torrent in Glenfinlas. And Ruskin wanted Millais not just to capture the flowing of the water, but also the rock formations under his feet and behind him. Because, as Ruskin's father said, the thing that he loved best in the world was geology. That was his first love. Understanding what is under our feet is his first love. And so if you look at the quality of the painting of the stones here, you understand that matters as much as the face of the artist. And it perhaps helps to see how John Ruskin was also responding to these beautiful surroundings, the very complex folded rocks that were in the area of Glenfinlas, and that Ruskin spent many, many hours himself just studying the rocks. And what you see here is that he doesn't see rocks as being static, as being monolithic, as it were. He sees them as always changing. So the water here is undercutting the rocks, and little bits of the rocks will be falling into the water and being carried downstream, and they will carry on their life elsewhere. And then you have these tiny crevices with small plants finding their footholds, and that again is a new way in which nature takes over. And so he always sees it as a continuum rather than an end point. Now, unfortunately, as anybody who's been on holiday in the Trossachs will know, the weather was not great, and even though it was July, and so Ruskin spends a lot of time at his desk trying to finish his work on the stones of Venice, and Effie, his young wife, and John Everett Millais go out for long, rather wet walks, muddy walks. And for those of you who know what happens next, there is an end time that comes shortly after this holiday, and Effie is able to get an annulment for their marriage because the marriage was never consummated, and so she is not Mrs. Ruskin, she's still Miss Gray. Once Effie has left, Ruskin himself goes away. He doesn't want any fuss, his parents don't want any fuss. They in fact say that they're very grateful to be rid of his commonplace Scotch wife. And as usual at that time of year, they decide they're still going to go on their holiday to Switzerland. They go to Chamonix, and this is one of the drawings that Ruskin made at that point. Again, a really intense, close study of a rock that is surrounded by grass and greenery, and also water, or maybe a part of a glacier coming down. It's a very abstract picture, in fact, coming so close that it's very difficult to see exactly what the context is here. But he was very happy in this part of the world. He loved visiting the Alps all the way through this period of his life. It was a place of retreat, but it didn't allow him to escape from the difficulties of his personal life in many ways. He carried them with him, and his melancholy increased during these years until he became really quite unwell with depression by the mid-1870s. And at that point, he's been a great art teacher, he has been Slade Professor in Oxford. He is recognised as the person who can make or break an artist's career, and yet he finds that he is constantly pulled back to these places which mattered to him as a young man, and which he finds just brings sort of sadness and nostalgia. When he went to see, for example, this tomb of a young woman who died in her early 20s, he writes, when he made this drawing, that 30 years ago, that was in the summer of the 1840s, I began my true study of Italian and all other art here beside the statue of Ilaria del Corretto, recumbent on her tomb. It turned me from the study of landscape to that of life, being myself in the fullest strength of labour and joy and hope. And he goes on to say, I feel the separation between me and the people around me so bitterly, the world of my own which they cannot enter, not father and mother, for they have left me, nor children nor lands, for I have none. And so he turns instead, at this middle period of his life, back to the Alps, where he had seen the sort of vision of the possibility of the beauty of nature, of God's handiwork as he sees it through the Alps. And he spends a lot of time in this area trying to decide whether to spend, in fact, the winters there. It's much colder. He's usually there in the summer, and he does spend a couple of winters and realises it's just not suitable for him to try and overwinter. But this is the view that he would wake up to. He said the view from his pillow as he opened his eyes. And this idea of being able to enjoy and also to capture for us, to be able to put on to paper the delight in opening your eyes to the world and seeing the little house in the foreground, but these extraordinary monumental mountains beyond. And his love of the mountains persisted, so that when he did settle back in England after his parents had died, he had bought a house at Brantwood in the Lake District, and he wanted somewhere where he could be quiet, where he could look at the sun rising and the sun setting, where he could go for long walks. We tend to think of him as being very desk-bound, but actually he loved going out and chopping wood and gardening and rowing across the lake at Coniston Water. And this is his little bedroom, obviously a bachelor's bedroom, where he surrounded himself by the pictures that he had bought and that his father had given him as well. His father had spent a huge amount of money on Ruskin, buying him works, particularly by Turner. So around his bed are all these beautiful watercolours by Turner that his father had acquired for him. And all the money that Ruskin had, all of his travels, all of his purchases, they were because of his father. Ruskin didn't earn any money himself. He relied entirely on his parents all the way through to the end of his life to have these beautiful things around him. And we can see in this picture a number of very lovely watercolours, which he used to carry with him actually when he was travelling. He had a special travelling box for his Turners, so he was never without them when he woke up. And this idea of Turner being with him at all times, I think is very important. We see in this little watercolour that Turner dashed off at some point, probably on a rainy day when he had his sketchbook rolled up in his pocket, and just a few colours, a blue and then this touch of yellow for the sunshine on the horizon. And I love to think of this picture as Ruskin and Turner themselves sort of striding through into the storm and knowing that it's inevitable. The weather will come down on their heads, but there's a sense of persistence and also companionship that these two figures keep going together. And we can see also in the swiftness of the watercolour application, the confidence. This is something that Ruskin himself wanted to learn from Turner and wanted to teach other people. And so Ruskin loved to practice his watercolour paintings, particularly early in the morning, and he'd get up and try and capture the dawn, the colours of the sun as it rose over the old man of Coniston, and the mist over the water, and that sense of peace which he found at Coniston despite the turmoil in his head. He was finding life very difficult. He had an unfortunate legal falling out with James Whistler in the 1870s, later 1870s, and he had fallen in love with another young woman who became ill and could not marry him, and he lost his parents. And the whole thing, combined with what he was seeing in his sketchbooks and his diaries when he talked to people, he became very aware of what he called the storm cloud of the 19th century, which was coming down upon him, and it led to a great sadness and at times great anger. And we see him here towards the end of his life out on the water, in fact on the ice, in front of Brantwood. We can just see the house in the background. It's surrounded by the people who kept him company. He was never alone at Brantwood. His cousin Joan Severn had come to work as his housekeeper, live with him, and when she married and she had her children, so there were always people in the house and visitors. But when he became very ill, she describes how, she says, he raves in the same clear voice and exquisite inflection of tone, the most unmeaning words, modulating now and then with tender sweetness, now with fierceness like a chained eagle. And this man who had held these extraordinary lectures and gathered people to him and tried to explain the complexities of the world and how we might build differently or work differently or paint differently, he was coming closer and closer and reduced in this way to the old man in the wheelchair. But one of the reasons that he kept having these moments of lucidity, and he is constantly aware of the impact of industrialization on the world that he has known. And that is the thing that upsets him more than anything. He can see coming across not only the Lake District but also his beloved Alps. He can see what he calls the black, dry plague cloud of chimney smoke flying hellishly over the whole sky. And over years and years of keeping diaries, keeping visual records in his notebooks, drawing the sunshine, drawing the rain, he is aware that the polluted skies are different and the climate is changing. And I know that in these days the issue of climate change has been extremely visible to us, but it's something that Ruskin himself was talking about and writing about in the 1870s and 1880s. And in 1884, he gives a lecture called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, where he talks about what we have done to the world as being effectively a blasphemy, because we have not looked after the world that was given to us. He writes about the blanched sun, the blighted grass, and blinded man. So we are suffering along with the landscape. And we can see here this extraordinary picture of a glacier that he made. It's in pen and ink. And he has been studying these glaciers. He has been looking so carefully at them over many, many years. And he writes about the gradual perishing of beauty from the loveliest scenes which I knew in the physical world, by the steady diminishing of the glaciers north of the Alps, and still more of the sheets of snow on their southern slopes. He is aware that the glaciers are retreating and that is making a difference to all of the climate around the Alps. He takes photographs. He's been taking photographs since the 1850s. This is probably the very earliest photograph of a glacier. He and his servant Frederick Crawley have carried the big camera and its tripod up to the Mer de Glace in Chamonix, somewhere that he knew very well, and have taken this extraordinary photograph of the surface of the Mer de Glace, and you can see how it extends far, far, far down into the valley and the undulating, the ragged surface of it. Now, in order to see how this has changed over the years and to see how we could bring Ruskin's words home to us now, when I worked on an exhibition last year at York Art Gallery, we asked a Royal Academician, Emma Stibben, if she would go back to the Mer de Glace, and she visited this area over many years, and so she took some photographs there, and we can see the great difference between, she's standing in exactly the same spot that Ruskin has stood in, and now in her photograph, which she's made into a cyanotype, all the ice, all the glacier has disappeared. And Ruskin was already aware of this. He wrote in 1874, I was able to cross the dry bed of a glacier which I had seen flowing 200 feet deep over the same spot 40 years ago. And so this awareness of how the glaciers retreat and how that will change the local area is very much the forefront of Ruskin's concerns about the way in which we have treated the natural world. And this is what Emma Stibben wanted to address. She looked at the aiguilles, these sort of needle-like points of rock, and she knew that many of the aiguilles that Ruskin had known around Mont Blanc are no longer there. They've fallen off because they're no longer held together by the ice that was fixing them in place, that the walking routes, the climbing routes that Ruskin would have known and were there all the way through the early 20th century have just disappeared. They've melted away and the rock falls are making it too dangerous. So this was something that dogged Ruskin at the end of his life, but it also shows that the way he looked so closely, the way that he looked so carefully and encouraged us to look, enables us then to take the next steps, to have him with us when we've got his evidence and we can use that to then start to plan for the next stage. How can we change the way in which we deal with the natural world, how we take responsibility? And the other thing that I think is very important to remember with Ruskin is he did transform people's lives. He gave them confidence. He gave them the chance to open up their own skills. So with his books that he wrote, like The Elements of Drawing, that was a textbook deliberately designed for young women or for men who didn't have the leisure, didn't have the time to go to art classes, or were excluded from them because of their position in society. And yet he taught these people how to draw. He gave them the things to draw when he gave great collections of art and geological specimens to places like Oxford or Sheffield. And so Anne Elizabeth Seton, about whom we know very little, was learning from Ruskin and transforming her own experience of the world and her own sense of self-worth by making these beautiful drawings in his memory. And then we see continuing the way in which Ruskin's sort of hands-on impact is still working. He always insisted on the importance of, doing things right and knowing why we are making decisions. And so one of the things that he set up was the Guild of St. George, which was a philanthropic society, a charity, to encourage people to connect with art, but also to connect back to the land. And so he was given a piece of oak forest very close to Redditch in the Black Country, Bewdley, just outside Bewdley, and he was given this piece of land and encouraged encouraged people to farm there, to visit there. And this is still going. So Ruskin Land still exists, and it's a place where people can go to do woodworking. There are herds of cattle there, and young people can go there. Young people who are experiencing mental health problems, just as Ruskin did, can go back there and spend some time just in the forest. And this is what we all miss so much at the moment, isn't it? That outdoors time of just being able to sit and listen to the bird song, and to think about the world beyond the window. Well, this is what is still going on in Ruskin's memory, and it's a living legacy. So we don't have to think about him always as being somebody who is preaching to us. We can also think of him as somebody who is travelling with us, who is encouraging us to engage as closely as possible with the small scale things that we have at our disposal now, and also to think about how we might live differently. And so Ruskin doesn't let us off easily, but he doesn't talk down to us either. And I think one of the loveliest things he ever wrote is the blessing that he offers to his readers at the beginning of The Crown of Wild Olives. So I'll just finish with that, which is Ruskin's blessing to us. He wants us to enjoy free-heartedness and graciousness and undisturbed trust and requited love and the sight of the peace of others and the ministry to their pain. These and the blue sky above you and the sweet waters and flowers of the earth beneath and mistress and presences innumerable of living things. These may yet be your riches. So I hope we may all meet again at the Watts Gallery, and that we can get out to enjoy the wonderful world that Ruskin has opened up to us. Thank you very much.